The road trip. I was 9 years old in 1976. I was the youngest of 3 children. Over summer vacation that year, my parents had driven us from Pennsylvania to Maine, where we'd spent a week at a beach eating hot dogs, fudge, and other treats on the boardwalk. Sunburnt and tired, we were ready to get back home to enjoy the last 2 weeks of summer before school started again. I laid in the back of the station wagon and watched the road disappear behind us. I always used to joke that my parents up front could see the future, and I was staring into the past in the way back. My brother and sister, who were 13-year-old twins, were pressed against each other, passed out and dead to the world as they dreamt of who knows what. At one point, my dad mentioned we'd be stopping at the nearest motel, but we needed gas first to get there. So he pulled over at the nearest Shell station, and he and I went to use the bathroom, and I helped him pump gas. As my dad held the nozzle, a man walked up to him and asked him where he was heading and if it was at all possible to get a ride. Behind the man stood his son, a small boy who didn't look more than 4 or 5. He looked scared. My dad hesitated. He was a really nice guy, my dad, but he explained that his wife and us kids were with him, and he wasn't sure. The man pleaded with him, said he'd get out at the motel and find his own way from there. The boy stared at me. I felt bad for him. Well, my dad said. Next thing I knew, to my mom's utter horror, the man squeezed in next to my brother and sister, who had woken up, and squeezed even closer to each other, trying not to sit anywhere near this stranger. My sister smiled at him fakely, trying not to seem rude. His little boy climbed into the back next to me. None of that could happen today. Despite the fact that my mother wasn't pleased about it, it wasn't like it was a totally unheard of thing back then. I don't even think it was illegal or anything like that. We were a bit oblivious back then. I don't know which is worse, to be honest with you. Being oblivious and possibly having stranger danger, or living your life in fear and never doing anything. The man told my father about how he'd had a really bad year, and he was so grateful for my family's kindness to give him a ride. His son kept staring at me. It was making me increasingly uncomfortable. He was very pale, and I wondered if he might be carsick. I really hoped not, because I hated the sight of puke. I pulled one of my G.I. Joe toys out of my backpack and handed it to him. "Here, you can have this if you want," I said. This seemed to bring a smile to his face. He didn't say anything, but he started to play with the action figure. He seemed really happy until he suddenly realized that there was a toy knife in the action figure's hand. He stared at it for a long time, turning it over and over again in his hand. Then, out of nowhere, he threw it at me. It hit my shoulder hard. I was taken aback and I didn't know what to do. If he had been older, I would have yelled at him or thrown something back, but he was so little. I didn't know what to do, so I just looked out the back of the station wagon and watched the stars go by. When we pulled into the motel, I was relieved. The man shook my dad's hand and thanked him. "Where are you off to now?" my dad asked him. "Oh, I'll either get myself a room or I'll hitch a ride with a trucker. You folks have a good evening." With that, he walked away. His boy followed behind him. Not very closely, but he followed behind him. Neither of them spoke to each other. I was so tired that I fell asleep as soon as my head hit the pillow. The next morning, I walked down to the free breakfast bar. There at a table by himself, eating scrambled eggs and a donut, was the man we'd given a ride to. "Hello," I said. "Oh, hello, young man. How are you this morning?" "I'm okay. Where's your boy?" I asked. The man nearly choked on his eggs. "My what?" "Your son. You know, the boy who was with you last night?" I reminded him, thinking maybe he was already drunk. I'm afraid you're mistaken, young man. I have no children. I've never married either." Now, I wouldn't normally argue with an adult, but my sanity was being questioned. "Maybe he wasn't your son, but he was with you, remember? He's really small. He had on an orange shirt and a blue pair of jeans, remember?" The man dropped his fork, his hand shaking. He glared at me with bug eyes. "Look, kid, I don't know what you're talking about." He stood up quickly and stormed off, heading out the front door. "What was that all about?" my mom asked as she walked up behind me. "What did you say to that man?" I sighed. I asked him where his son was, the boy that sat with me in the car last night. He tried to say there was no boy. He's nuts. My mom shook her head. "Okay, first of all, I don't want you talking to another adult like that. Do you understand me? Second of all, what are you talking about? There was no boy with that man. You were alone in the back seat." The rest of my family agreed. They insisted there was no boy. I insisted they were crazy. We had a little car trouble that day and ended up having to spend one more night at the motel. That evening, my mother was flipping through the channels and stopped suddenly on a local news broadcast. She dropped the remote and made a weird groaning sound. We all looked to the TV. There on the news was a big color photograph of the man we'd given a ride to. Then 2 other pictures popped up, and I froze. The newscaster began to speak. "Timothy Harden has been arrested and charged in the stabbing death of 5-year-old Andrew Larson and his 36-year-old mother, Carol Larson. Carol's body was found strangled in her bedroom, and Andrew's body was found in his bed, stabbed to death. Andrew was still wearing the clothes that he had worn to camp that day, an orange t-shirt and a pair of blue jeans. I thought of the G.I. Joe in the car. We all cried for Andrew and his mom. We were in shock that we'd given a murderer a ride, and I never forgot the brief moment that I had with the sad ghost. I often hoped that he was able to move on and not follow around endlessly the man who did him harm. Maybe the minute Timothy was arrested, Andrew was at peace. I really hope so. And I never, ever pick up spare writers.